My view is right now, humans have entered the tool phase vis-a-vis AI. It's gotten to be powerful enough that it's clearly a beneficial tool. What people haven't thought through is this is the first technology in human history that doesn't stop at tool.
Yeah.
All right. As it gets more agency of its own, and its intellect ultimately grows beyond human intellect, then you have to come to grips with the fact that this thing is basically a new species. And as you get into this period of time, the real question for me is how do humans take advantage of the partnership that I think we can guarantee is still available to us in this coexistence period in order to decide how do the humans themselves want to prepare for the world of ultimately coevolution. To me, the key goal, is not to anticipate the final stages, but to create a window of opportunity where humans have a partner that's super intelligent and still, by and large, working hard to help us out. Once you get out of that period, then you are on a coevolutionary path. And you have to think, okay, where does that end up? There's only a few possible outcomes. One is that one becomes irrelevant relative to the other. One is that there's a long-term symbiotic relationship. And the third is there's some kind of hybridization between the two evolved environments or species. And so those to me are unknowable outcomes. All you can do is try to hedge the bets for humans, by making sure that in the early stages, we retain a real partnership, symbiotic relationship between the evolving machine and the humans.
This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned into The Trajectory. This is the 8th episode in our AGI Governance series, and I have never had a conversation move so quickly from AGI Governance to cosmic posthuman futures in my life. And this is not with a fiction author or AGI philosopher. This was someone who was the chief strategy and research officer for Microsoft proper. Craig Mundie was a very high-ranking Microsoft executive for a great many years. He was with the company for almost a quarter century, and recently co-authored a book called Genesis with Eric Schmidt, who of course was the CEO of Google for quite some time. We speak this week with Craig about how AGI labs might sort of coordinate among themselves in a way that serves the world and is somewhat safe in the near term, but how in the long term, we've sort of got to be able to accept that the great process of life of which we are part should bloom. I was not expecting this kind of cosmic access from Craig until we got into the thick of things, and I'll have a lot more to say in the outro of this episode. But this is a very unique AGI Governance episode in terms of where we go. Without further ado, let's fly right in. This is Craig Mundie here in The Trajectory. So Craig, thanks for being here.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. We're getting into the bigger picture of artificial general intelligence, which I think you've got a good square view of some of the challenges of getting there and then also ultimately where it takes us. We're going to try to touch on both. But to start with, you kind of don't come to this from a purely existential first and then try to work our way to handle that space. You come to it from a different space. Talk about sort of like, I guess, your origin point in dealing with these problems, because it is a bit unique from some of the other discussions here.
Well, I come at this with the idea that we're building the most powerful technology humans have ever invented. As such, it has capabilities that we've never had to deal with before, and it creates situations both on the upside and the downside that classical methods of dealing with, are inadequate to address. And so first, I think that the imperative has to be to wring every possible ounce of advantage for humanity out of the arrival of this capability. And do that while trying to suppress the things that could potentially go wrong. Where I differ from many is I think there are many, many, many steps along things that could go either well or not well. And some of these can have pretty catastrophic effects too. But they're not necessarily the ones that come because the AI goes rogue at the end of the day. So for example, one of the things I'm very worried about right now with AIs as we know them today is their effects on cybersecurity. I think, it's going to represent a huge accelerator for people who want to wage cyber attacks or incursions. And that, in fact, it's going to make that something that a lot more people can do. And that's a big problem. So since we don't even have a good way of keeping that from happening, I think we have to focus first on immediate problems, learn by doing, build some consensus or collaboration mechanisms around these immediate problems, and then work our way as quickly as we can into a solution that does, in fact, preclude, some type of downstream catastrophic effect.
Yeah, well, and I know, Eric was just speaking with Diamandis about the potential emergence of superintelligence, and that this is maybe not a 50-year forward thing like we would have presumed however many years ago. But I think what you're saying, I'm just going to nutshell here, it seems to be, hey, we're going to have a whole bunch of stuff that right here, right now, we got to be concerned as an international community. Let's knit this together. Let's start to solve some things. Let's talk. Let's figure it out. And then oh my goodness, if it takes over the world questions, it's like, if we're really working on what we can work on now, that's a more productive initial stance. Is this a correct distillation, or would you word it differently?
I'm saying you got to have kind of a crawl, walk, run approach.
Yeah.
But you better get from here to a world-class sprinter in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah.
And that makes this problem extra hard. And, but I don't see a way to do this by trying to take one giant leap forward, at the current state of development.
Yeah.
And without any model for how this kind of governance can be developed, I just don't think you get there in a single step.
Yeah.
It's like being born full grown and ready to run.
Yeah. Well, we just had Dean Juilan here talking about kind of the regime complex problem of, maybe the UN's got a reason, maybe the ACs, sort of the AI safety institutes have a reason, maybe, sort of agreements from the companies themselves have a purpose. There's going to be sort of different strata that solve for different things. And this is going to have to be an evolving process, not, as you had said, we write the rules so it never takes over and we plug it in for good. I mean, so do you also concur with sort of that multi-factor knitting as probably the way this is solved, or do you emphasize something different?
I emphasize something different.
Let's do it.
Largely based on 40 or 50 years of doing software systems at scale. Most of the way the world has evolved and ultimately created rules and standards around software systems is based on some consensus that happens between companies that build products that are successful. In the software world, because it's so malleable, you don't have a requirement for a priori standardization the way you do in the sort of physics of hard systems. If you have trains and you don't agree on the gauge of the rails, you can't move one car to the next railway system.
Yeah.
In software, you can essentially adjust it over time. As a result, the software world has evolved almost all standards by de facto standardization by authoritative bodies after the products have essentially established a direction. And so I think that the AI industry is only now beginning to approach the point in time where they'll recognize that the best way to produce an answer is to get a small number of them together and agree on some strategy that they could both, or 2 or 3 or 4 of them, implement and then offer to the world as a solution. And that solves the problem of if a regulatory body or an academic group tries to come up with an answer and then cram it down on the companies, they have no way of knowing whether any or all of them would actually be able to implement it. Reciprocally, if you just take one idea and try to, from one company and try to make it, something everybody has to do, you don't understand the negotiation that has to take place technologically in order to get these things into some common mode of operation. And so mostly my own experience was that it was a market demand for a capability where there were competing companies who offered the marketplace a product and then realized it was in their mutual interest to have some common aspect for interoperability or whatever it might be. So if it was me, I would encourage the idea for what this common mode way of starting out would come from some of the companies. If you want that to move in a more international way, then it would be great if you could take, for example, a U.S. company and a Chinese company and have them decide it was in their interest to sit down and come up with some strategy to help with these problems. And then you might have a basis of gathering around that thing and building a regulatory regime or a standards-oriented approach to that.
Yeah, I mean, it harkens to kind of IEEE stuff, Wi-Fi standards, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, but actually, all of the things you just mentioned had a precursor that was just some products that people built.
Totally.
And then they got critical mass, and then they got standardized.
Of course. IEEE didn't come down from the heavens and say,
it's better
is how
to think
Wi-Fi will work.
Of IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force.
Yeah.
Right? This is just a bunch of engineers who got together and say, hey, we got to agree on some protocols, or these things won't talk to each other.
Yeah.
And that has happened over and over again. The whole concept of how networking standards emerged, wasn't by a standards body sitting down and writing the spec. It was looking at the products, and where the companies would get together and have, you used to call them plug fests. Literally, people would show up in an auditorium someplace, and they would all start trying to plug the systems together and figure out what worked and what didn't work, and then they'd fix what it was. Question in my mind is, what's the analog to that might begin to get us on a good path here?
Well, it's a great question. And to your point, I think the consideration is what makes that international. I mean, already we just see super brute arms race dynamics towards, birthing the sand god between Zuckerberg and OpenAI and Musk, and everybody's sort of like, on Joe Rogan saying, there's an X% chance this will end us all, but I got to throw down and race as fast as I can to get there. There's just between the Western folks coming up with what you've said. I don't think it's impossible, but I think many people would say they'd want to see what you articulated, that dynamic, how that crosses the ocean to this side of the pond. How do you see that happening? What does it mean to get those conversations going?
First, I think you have to recognize that any strategy that is predicated on giving up strategic competition is a loser. All right. That's been true all the way back to nuclear weapons. All right.
Yeah, incentives rule the world. I'm not arguing there. Yeah.
But despite the fact that you have strategic competition in this case, both the corporate level and at the national level, doesn't mean that you can't agree that there's some interest that you have in common.
Totally. Yeah. What are those?
But you have to carefully factor that out. And so my view is that you can't start by asking these companies to give up their market position or their trade secrets and how they perform or build their products. What you have to do is say, look, you all have a common problem. The common problem could be market access someplace. The common problem, might be that their customers have decided that as happened in the cloud environment, that they actually want to build their solutions on multiple products. Many companies today, use multiple cloud providers, each providing some additional benefits, but also providing some insulation against, failures or lock-ins or price gouging or whatever it might be that you worry about. So I don't see why we wouldn't expect the same thing to happen here. As these major AI systems increasingly take on the normal software architecture of there's platforms and there's apps, all right? The platforms almost always get established by apps that come from the platform provider, but then they get opened up. And that was how the PC got made. It's how the iPhone got made. It's how pretty much all the platform technologies get made. And so we're just at that crossover now where we're starting to see the emergence of the apps on the platforms.
Yeah.
And the companies are starting to buy them. Remember, in the last couple of years, unlike many other things, the first consumers of these products were the first buyers of these products were consumers.
Yep.
Oftentimes it emerges the other way, where companies are the first buyers, and then it goes down to the consumer marketplace. So this one's crossed over, but the emergence of the enterprise market for apps built on these things, perhaps in a multi-platform environment, perhaps requiring on the part of the user that there's more of a common way of thinking about how they're going to control or monitor these things. I think these will provide a market signal that these companies will find that they have some elements that where they should agree on how they should come together, even though they're competing like
obviously.
crazy.
Yeah. So, okay. So if I'm hearing you correctly, maybe we're not seeing that sort of, let's call it self-coordination right now, because maybe we're just not in a mature enough space where those problems have enough teeth. It's a bunch of individual users. We get some revenue coming in, but we're not at the catalyst point. But there will be a tipping point whereby, we all got the same trust issues around this data thing, or we all have this same issue. And for you, some set of catalyzing shared problems would be in the collective best interest of the group to sort of circle around. What are the best candidates for that for you? When you look forward and say, what's going to get Musk and Altman in the same room and figuring stuff out? What are the catalyst candidates for you?
Well, I think it's the need for companies to build application suites on a multi-platform environment and deploy them internationally. Because all of these companies are increasingly finding the problem that's a little different than the one they had in the past, which is the platform they're building on is not fully deterministic.
Yeah.
And so the classic models of determining whether your products are even compliant with the laws in the countries in which you want to ship it to has suddenly become a harder problem. And so, there's an example where if tools can be made that would allow people to say, hey, if your company wants to build a bunch of products and they want to use part OpenAI, part Anthropic, and part X AI, then how do I know that these things, when they're interacting, or perhaps in the agentic environment? See, both of these things in my mind are emerging like right now is big enterprise customers.
Yeah.
You start to see big investments being made there. And we're just expecting this year, now the emergence of agentic behavior. Agents have to talk to each other. The industry's going to have to find some way, not only to let them talk, but to trust that they're talking to each other in some reasonable under some reasonable discipline. And to me, this is just the nascent signs of a repeat of what has a movie we've seen before over and over again in the software industry. And it's why I think even without any other stimulus than the international enterprise market, we're likely to see their own products beginning to create demand for this.
It's almost like a very optimistic, there's multiple components of, I think, from what I know of your thought that I consider to be optimistic, but also pretty reasonable. This one is sort of, hey, as this stuff develops, this brute arms race that feels like just a brute arms race will somewhat inevitably have to find ways to be safe and trusted and whatever, and they'll have to get together. And when you had said deploy internationally, it almost sounds like, hey, by the time Musk and Altman got to get in the same room about this, they got to be calling on China at the same time, too. If I'm hearing you correctly, this is sort of what you're saying, is that the trust that will be...
Whether they have to call on China or not is sort of less an issue in the beginning. It's whether or not there's a set of rules that they have to follow in China that are different than the ones in the U.S., which are different than the ones in the U.K., which are different than the ones in Europe. And of course, today that is provably the case. And so if the companies want to have access to the global markets with interoperability, then they're going to have to agree how in the world do these things talk to one another. And here, talk has to be considered as a much higher level concept than it was when we were just talking about how to send packets back and forth.
Yep. I'm going to save our last 10 minutes for sort of the bigger picture of where this takes us. But when you think about we have this provable scenario where different rules in China than the UK, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think will get the labs and all those different geos to sort of find the complex way of doing the talking? In other words, when the Oracles of the world or Walmarts of the world or whoever, they're all trying to use this stuff and figure it out. The labs have to figure it out. What do you think will catalyze the first discourses between DeepSeek leadership and OpenAI leadership or what have you? What are the thresholds where it's like, oh, I'd expect them to be in the same room around this time?
Well, it turns out that if the governments wanted to encourage this, they would basically say, if you guys have a common mechanism whereby U.S. products can operate in China and Chinese products can operate in the United States, then, there's an incentive there for the companies to find a way to attest to the fact that the thing will be well behaved in each place based on the rules of the place, not the rules of the developers.
Yeah.
And, my own belief about how this can happen is that you have to use an AI to ultimately govern these AIs. And that includes the idea, of how can they then be, in a unified way, be brought into alignment with some of these well-established rules.
Yeah. And so this kind of takes us into what eventually this would lead to. So there's this, I consider this a very optimistic and reasonable stance of there will be coordination that will be emergent out of self-interest. Governments may be able to nudge it, but the companies innovating will be able to get it done. In terms of where that takes us, what I think is really fascinating, very few people that I think consider these dynamics of adoption we're talking about also consider squarely and manfully what this ultimately means species and trajectory of intelligence wise. Those are different conversations. Those are normally food groups I'm not going to get in the same meal. But you've thought a good deal about that. You guys have a piece in Time talking about kind of coevolution, and you've got, the three stages of tool, the middle one, coexistence, and then coevolution. Yeah. Right. So, that also strikes me as maybe more optimistic. Again, I'm not using optimistic in a derogatory way, than sort of the idea of it's an entity and it will naturally compete with us. It's almost sort of the framing, and I want to make sure I'm not framing it too lightly, is that, hey, the natural shebang here is not a thing that competes with us in any meaningful way, at least not initially. It's an extension of us, and it'll sort of be this other layer over the intelligence that is mostly humans that's mixed on the earth. And a symbiosis is almost like going to be what happens as the way this emerges.
No, that's not exactly the way I think.
Lay it on me.
You've got the right words, but not exactly the right, synthesis.
Cool.
I also want to talk about this view of sort of optimism, although maybe realism. I'm focused on not what is of interest, but how you can actually try to achieve it. There's a lot of discussion here and elsewhere that's talking about what they worry about, but not how they do anything about it. And so I'm grounded in, as an old guy, many decades of watching how the software world evolves and works as an economic system. But we also know that these high-scale tech systems redefine how our societies operate. And so there's no confusion that this one is the biggest of all of them, and the impact is, requires the most consideration.
Yeah.
And at least some of the people I know are pretty, well considered in the way they think about that. So my view is right now, humans have entered the tool phase vis-a-vis AI. It's gotten to be powerful enough that it's clearly a beneficial tool. What people haven't thought through is this is the first technology in human history that doesn't stop at tool.
Yeah.
All right. As it gets more agency of its own, as it gets the ability to perhaps even operate in the physical world through robotics and other mechanisms, and its intellect ultimately grows beyond human intellect, then you have to come to grips with the fact that this thing is basically a new species. And it didn't get made by synthetic biology. It got made by software. But nonetheless, it has all the species properties. And as you get into this period of time, the real question for me is, how do humans take advantage of the partnership that I think we can guarantee is still available to us in this coexistence period in order to decide how do the humans themselves want to prepare for the world of ultimately coevolution. To me, the key goal, is not to anticipate the final stages, but to create a window of opportunity where humans have a partner that's super intelligent and still, by and large, working hard to help us out.
Yep.
And whether you can sustain that forever or not, I don't even know.
Yeah, I don't.
But what I do believe is this AI, this superintelligent thing, did not arrive on a spaceship. All right. We made it. We're still making it. As a result, we have some control over it. And we may not know how to extend that control in perpetuity, but at least in this finite period of time, I think we can influence that outcome. So my goal is to create this environment where, while we have this coexistence time, and it hasn't sort of so completely outrun or become misaligned, with our own interest, we have to decide, well, what is the ultimate human interest? How do we evolve ourselves to some extent? Not by waiting around for natural selection, which is too slow relative to the rate of change.
Yeah.
But where humans start to make adjustments to humans. And then that alters the way you think about this problem. One of the things that troubles me right now is how many people already seem to view themselves as the victim. That this thing is arrived. We have, we're losing our agency. We don't know how to control it. And therefore we're victims. And I don't know why we would resign ourselves to victimhood at this point. This is like early innings. And we're getting to the period of time where, as it becomes more capable, we should be able to use it in a partnership way to do things that we otherwise could not do for ourselves. And so I don't know what the asymptotic limit of human capability is.
Yeah.
But I think it can be accelerated, whether it's in health or intellect or input-output systems or whatever it might be, in a partnership with these machines. Once you get out of that period, then you are on a coevolutionary path. And you have to think, okay, where does that end up? There's only a few possible outcomes. One is that one becomes irrelevant relative to the other. One is that there's a long-term symbiotic relationship. Mm-hmm. And the third is there's some kind of hybridization between the two evolved environments or species. And so those to me are unknowable outcomes. All you can do is try to hedge the bets for humans, by making sure that in the early stages, we retain a real partnership, symbiotic relationship between the evolving machine and the humans.
I'll nutshell what you're saying. This is a great clarification here. I think there's correlates to this kind of period of considering where we're going, this coexistence sort of window. To your point, at where evolution takes us. I mean, if we could predict evolution, we'd know everything.
But see, I think human evolution is like over, all right, because the classic model of evolution is too slow.
Oh, of course. And
so for the first time, but only with the help of these machines, humans can start to make adjustments to the humans, to deal with the things we don't like. I think initially we'll call it healthcare, and we'll design out diseases. But who knows where that goes?
Well, I think to your point there, I think it seems like the great flame of life, the process of which we are part, seems to be sort of a thing. And it seems like all torches are pretty temporary. And so we might make a good situation for our torch, but at some point the flame goes on and does other things, right? You and I are not single cells. It does other stuff. So the idea of sort of setting up the conditions to discern with a super intelligent aid, which in the early days is pretty symbiotically connected to us, to discern what be that trajectory of where the flame is going to go. And can we get a good shake as a torch on our way in that trajectory? I think is completely reasonable. And I don't think enough people consider it. I think people say, well, hominids as they are, opposable thumbs, armpit hair, etc., are and should be the eternal locus of moral value and agency in the totality of the cosmos until the end of time. And I would say this strikes me as both impossible and probably morally wrong.
Well, not a completely accurate extrapolation from what happened so far, right? I mean,
what do you mean?
Well, we're Homo sapiens, but there were a bunch of pre-Homo sapiens.
Oh, of course, yes.
So a simple way to ask the question is, what's after Homo sapiens?
That's the question we should be asking. And I think it's very reasonable. And I wish in the intergovernmental world this was discussed more. This is the primary discussion I hope to catalyze, is to pause enough to say, if stasis isn't possible, and it's not, what are the best ways to discern and move towards the continuance of the blaze of which we are part, right? From nematode to man and to X, new substrates, everything is temporary. I think setting ourselves up for that is super challenging. I think there's obviously potential downside where the flame goes out, but also pretty empowering to consider where it could take us. And I think what you're saying is let's get to a locus where those decisions maybe can be wielded and the trajectory can be bent with a more informed scenario. And then where it goes long term, we don't know. But is there in your mind, because there's others, Stuart Russell, people I respect tremendously, who are really like, man, if it's not opposable thumbs steering the progression of the universe, it's a wrong universe. You're not of that opinion.
I'm not.
Is there almost a sense of that blaze is important and we should discern and allow it to unfold and be part of it for as long as we are? Is there almost the way enthusiasm?
I asked the question rhetorically, at least, is in the third possible outcome, long term, which is hybridization.
Yep.
What part should you keep from, quote, humans, and what part would you keep from the machines? And, where that balance lies, I think, is a function of what the humans decide to do during this period of coexistence.
Yeah. And it strikes me.
And it was interesting this morning in some of the discussions. Yeah. The other person, unprompted, who brought this up was another one of the computer science people. And I find that, a number of them are realizing that this is true. If you listen to Jeff Hinton's comments, he said the only way to do this, is to make the machine want to be kind to humans.
Yeah.
But Yoshua Bengio, who I guess you've talked to too, a year ago, he started down a path of saying, well, I've got to create this AI that can help us essentially keep the other ones on the straight and narrow. So I'd say at least I find some of the oldest guys anyway, at least thinking very broadly about where this outcome can go.
I'll close on this and get your thoughts, but I'm completely with you. When Bengio was the first ever episode of The Trajectory. I interviewed him before 10 years prior, had no interest in AGI at that time. I certainly did. But at that time, they weren't close enough and he just didn't consider it to be real deal. At the end of that interview, I asked him, what would you say to the people that want to recklessly birth AGI like tomorrow? And, he had some things to say. And then I said, what would you say to the people that no intelligence beyond human should ever evolve? And he had said, I think we should have sympathy for that which could become. And I think there's kind of an inevitability there. And I think that's a very mature perspective from Bengio. It strikes me that for Hinton and for Russell, again, both of whom I respect, there is a sort of, when I think about the stages of grief, we have denial, we have anger, we have bargaining. They're past bargaining. They're not bargaining, but they seem to be in depression. There is a stage called acceptance where we could say, I am part of the process of life. It's almost a higher perspective. And what could continue this blaze? And maybe that's almost an empowering place. Because if we stay in depression because we're so sad it's not going to have opposable thumbs, it does feel like your spectra of options just aren't as wide or as sparkling as if you get to acceptance. It almost strikes me that you're very much at acceptance in not a misanthropic way.
I think I bypassed the other stages.
Yeah.
I'm a naturally optimistic guy.
Well, it's optimistic, but not entirely wed to a particular shape you were born into. It sounds like, as in parting, do you see some of this inevitability thing you and I are talking about, of the flame going on, torches being temporary, we can't predict these things. You see that sort of dawning on more and more people in the coming years. And do you think that will help with this kind of trust and future vision that we're trying to do?
Well, I do see narrow examples, of people who are thoughtful starting to come to grips with this.
Yes, it takes a while.
It's partly why I think, putting these ideas out there and getting realized, because the trajectory you take, I think, needs to be informed a little bit about what you think, the options are in the future. And, if you say, no, this machine is just a machine and it'll always be just a machine, then you really, in my mind, you tee up an even greater tension between the human and the machine. The one we fear is going to have more agency and think, more expansively about that future. Whereas if you say, no, hey, we would welcome it if it turned out this thing really did develop full speciation, and man, we hope we can keep these things aligned, and then let's go someplace together. Yeah, that's coevolution.
Yeah. Yes.
And so I think it's important to say, you could seal your fate by essentially not being willing to acknowledge the possibility, at least, that's the course we're on.
Any attempt to lock in stasis, any marriage to any torch feels like tension is inevitable. And so I think that I have some optimism, to go back to that term, that more people will see some of the vision you're pointing folks to and consider more frankly and squarely the trajectory options that we have, which all involve change. So I think this has been a real blast. It's cool to be able to unpack your perspective. I know that's all we have for time, but Craig, it's been fun.
All right. We can go at it again.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Absolutely. Yes. So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. A big thank you to Craig for being with us, and thank you to you for listening all the way through to the end of this episode. I thought that Craig's ideas around how industry might govern itself actually had some credence. I'm very much not of the belief that industry could or should just run the whole thing themselves, but some of the process that he articulated and expected to see happen based on what we've seen in the past with big tech did actually feel like reasonable steps forward. I think we probably should have a menagerie and a tapestry of different ways that kind of coordination occurs at. But I think some of them led in that direction could be beneficial. So I've got my fingers crossed that Craig is right about that. In terms of the more cosmic side of things, I got to check out, Craig has a piece in Time magazine that I'm sure is quite Googleable, Craig Mundie, Time magazine. They sort of talk about the grand expanse of intelligence and sort of where this process might take us. Craig had this very, very frank way of speaking about it, as you saw. And this episode was recorded live at the WAIC conference in Shanghai, where Craig was involved in a number of panels and talks and whatnot. He has an article that I think is quite good about this, but his perspective is like very frank. Like, we we're not exactly sure where it would go, but it should continue to kind of grow and expand as it has. Very matter of fact. Almost no one speaks about it matter of factly. People often get philosophical, or they have a feeling like they have to kind of sell you on the fact that things are going to blossom farther than humanity. Craig's just like ice cold frank about it, and I love the tone. I think that is the way to talk about it. I think this great process of life should bubble beyond, and I think Craig's frankness in addressing it was surprising and refreshing. I mean, nobody within big tech with a current job there would ever speak the way Craig did. So having the roles he used to have at Microsoft was like, you can talk like this? It was like shocking, but really, really refreshing. I'd be interested to think what your takes were. Obviously, this was a governance episode that I kind of bent in the direction of worthy successor. What do you think of Craig's ideas writ large? What are your takes on his overall governance approach? We'd love to know in the comments down below. But otherwise, that's it for this episode. A little clue for you. The next episode in this governance series is with one of the, we might call the original godfather of AGI safety, at least from the academic side of things, who is also speaking live in China. So we've got another live episode for you in the coming week around AGI governance. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that one and look forward to catching you then.